essentially. Welcome everyone to the Ida Branch Library. I'm glad to see some faces here tonight. It is getting a little chillier out. I would like to introduce Jeremy Potter, who is a teacher at Ida Middle School. He has his class, the Backyard History class, that focuses on Ida local history. And tonight he is here to talk about 150 years of Ida schools. So please welcome Jeremy Potter. Thank you.
Wow, lots of familiar faces here. How many Ida graduates? Oh, wow, okay, about half or so.
I didn't go to, I went to Dundee.
You went to Dundee? I'm sorry.
But you
I
went
lived in Ida.
Oh, you lived in Ida? Okay.
well, you went there for 8 years.
Yeah.
And you went the first 8 years.
First 8 years? All right.
Yeah.
You'll have to tell us.
At dental school.
Oh, you went to dental? Okay. All right, over on Jackman Road. And,
Yeah, on the corner,
and Lulu.
on the corner of our farm.
Right, okay. Nice. Well, I'm going to take you through 150 years of Ida schools here tonight. If at any time you want to stop and share some stories, please feel free. We'll have some time to do that at the end. We have some trivia at the end too to see, especially for our Ida grads, I guess, how much you know about your school. So yeah, this coming year is actually our 150th year of Ida schools. It started actually in 1872, and you know, so it's been around. We've been around quite a long time. Before Ida schools started, back in the 1840s, 1850s, kids would have just gotten their education through homeschooling. Okay, there may have been a parent or a mom or someone who could take some of the local children in, and they would teach them just some of the very basic stuff, just basic reading, basic writing, you know, learning a little bit of arithmetic, those types of things. If you belong to one of our local churches, one of our Lutheran churches, or if you belong to St. Joe's Catholic Church into the 1850s and 60s, you could have gone to a church school as well. And so there were actually 3 church schools. The West Ida, East Ida, and St. Joe's Church all had church schools for their kids. Most of what they learned, actually, even in the Catholic Church, you would think they would have learned most of that in Latin, but all 3 schools actually taught much of what they taught in German, because we had so many German families around here. Okay. And kind of made sense in the Lutheran churches, but in the Catholic Church, you know, they kind of mixed in the Latin with the Lutheran a little bit as well. By the 1850s and 1860s, we were getting into our country schools, all right, and we had 15 one-room schoolhouses in the Ida area that serviced our local children. They were all independent school districts, and I think by 1944, 1945, at the height of the one-room schoolhouse days, we had 144 different one-room schoolhouses in Monroe County. So quite a few of them. How many of you attended a one-room? I know we had one that attended a one-room. Okay.
My brother-in-law did.
Your brother-in-law did?
Long Branch in Carlton.
Oh, okay.
He's only a couple years older than me, I think. Pretty long. In the 60s.
Yeah, and we'll talk about the consolidation of the schoolhouses a little bit later. But consolidation happened right up into the 1960s in Monroe County. I think the last school to consolidate into a district was actually the paper mill school out by the River Raisin, out by the library. They were an independent school up until the late 1960s, but they. You know, they stayed independent for quite a long time. So yeah, by 1945, we had over 144 schoolhouses in Monroe County, which is pretty amazing. Now, we did not have a school in the town of Ida until 1872, and that's where we mark the 150 years. Okay, that's where we're marking that right now. On December 20th of 1872, the school building that you see here opened up for the first time, just before Christmas. It was called the Fractional 7 Ida and Raisinville Township School. Fractional because a fraction of the students came from Ida Township, and a fraction of the students came from Raisinville Township. Okay. If you are familiar with the present day layout of our school at Ida right now, you'll know where our wood shop is located. It's located between our middle school and our high school currently. That is where that building actually sat, was right where that wood shop is. Okay. The first superintendent was a guy named Peter Riley. That name, of course, is still around Ida. We still have a number of Rileys around to this day. And don't know how long he stayed as superintendent. There's really no record of that. Likely only would have stayed a few years, as superintendents kind of came and went quite often back in those days. Okay. The early days of the village school, it was a 2-room schoolhouse. If you take a look there, the lower level would have likely housed the 1st through 4th grade. The upper level would have housed the 5th through 8th grade. When they added kindergarten later, they would have put them with the 1st through 4th graders. And your typical day would have started at 9 o'clock in the morning in our Ida Village School here. And when you came to school on a typical day, in the lower level, the 1st through 4th grade, the students would be broken up, and this was very similar to the country schools at the time too. The students would be broken up sometimes mostly by grade level, but for 10 minutes the teacher would spend 10 minutes on math with this group of students, and then would go spend 10 minutes of math with this group of students, and maybe another group would come over and help some of those other students. So when you were at dental, is that kind of how that worked? Did the upper grades kind of help out with the lower grades a little bit?
Not really.
No. Okay.
Most of the teaching was done by one person.
Okay.
And that was the teacher. And well, if you didn't have an oil stove, you chopped wood. That was one of the jobs that had to be done.
Right.
Get
Right.
wood for the wood stove. But
Yeah. Right.
we were fortunate by the time I went there, it was an oil stove.
Okay. And that was the same at the village school. Where wood would have to be brought in to heat the building. Water would actually, the students would actually have to go next door to the farmhouse, and they had an agreement with the farmer there that they could pump water out of the well. And that was actually located, I'm trying to think where that house was. That would have been just a little bit south of where that building was located. So I would say kind of out by our ball diamonds back there behind the school. Is where that was located. And so again, anyway, your typical day would have been reading, writing, arithmetic, orthography. What's orthography? Any idea? Orthography. Spelling. Yeah, it was called orthography at the time. Penmanship, which was really important, which I think we've kind of lost now these days. But if you look at my 7th graders writing, it's something we could probably go back to. But they would learn proper hygiene. They would learn, of course, they would learn history. They would learn physiology. They would learn all kinds of different things. Farming. They would learn agriculture in 6th, 7th, and 8th grade as well. I think on the table back there, I have one of our agricultural books from back then. So if you get a chance to take a look at that later, you can do that. Our school only lasted for 32 years though, our very first building. By 1904, the building had become unsafe. They used the wrong kind of brick to build it. It deteriorated a lot more quickly than it should have. The reports of students back then were they would be sitting in class, and on a windy day, the building would just start to shake a little bit back and forth. And so parents decided we're not going to send our kids to an unsafe school, so they started pulling their students out of school. And eventually the school district realized, yeah, we can't have this building anymore. So a farmer named John Scheid came in. He brought 4 of his horses. According to the record, he put a stout log through one window and out the other, hooked up a chain, pulled it with 4 horses, and started pulling the building down. So that's not a very safe building. Okay. And this is actually right now, this is the present day location. This is actually what stands at that site right now. That's our wood shop from 1951 that was built. Okay. So what do you do when you don't have a building to send your students to? Well, you have to find somewhere to send him to school. And that was where one of our local undertakers, Mr. Feenauer, came in. He was the undertaker. He was also the furniture maker in town. He gave comfort to the living and to the dead. All right, so he decided, well, I have the spare upstairs, and we can have the kids go to school up there. So for a couple of years, the students actually went to school at Feenauer's Furniture and Undertaking. I wouldn't want to be the kid who fell asleep there. But if you don't remember where Feenauer's was on the corner of Main Street and Ida Street. There's a little parking lot right there now for the daycare that is located right across the street. I think of it as the IGA. So that's what I think of it as. Okay. And so students went to school there. This is the class. I believe this was taken in 1905, if I remember correctly. This was a good chunk of the class that went to school at Feenauer's. You can even see the sign up here, Feenauer's Furniture and Undertaking. Okay. Well, if you're a growing town and you want to be taken seriously as a town, you can't have your students going to school in an undertaker shop, right? So that is where Senator Simeon Van Aken came in. And Senator Van Aken, he was a lawyer here in town. He had actually grown up in Hudson. He fought in the Civil War. On his way back through to Hudson one day, taking the train through Ida, he saw this growing little town. He decided to move here. So he eventually moved here, became a lawyer, did some other jobs around town as well. And then eventually in 1903, he was elected to the state senate. And so he was our first state senator. Pretty important guy because while he was state senator, some of the folks around here got to talking and said, you know, we really need to put a new school together. We can't just have our students going to Feenauer's Furniture and Undertaking for their schooling. And so he said, you're right. We need to find something else for our 1st through 8th graders. But a few of the folks got the idea, well, you know, if we're going to be a town that's going to be taken seriously, we probably need a high school. And so Senator Van Aken put together a Senate resolution in 1905, and it got passed in the state legislature unanimously to allow Ida to have a high school. So if you were living in Ida prior to 1905 and you wanted to go to high school, what do you think you did? Where would you go?
Monroe or Dundee.
You would go to Monroe, right? You could hop on the train and go to Monroe. You could hop on the train and go to Dundee. Some folks went down to Temperance or Lambertville if they lived in the southern part of our township. But that's what you did. Until about 1905, 1906 when we started building our very next building. Okay. So our new building, the 1906 school, is located on the site of our present-day cafeteria. How many of you went to that school or remember that school? Okay, a couple of you. All right, do you have stories? Any good stories about that building?
I remember we were in 7th and 8th grade and our classes were in that, most of our classes were in that building. The other high school had been built by that time. But you see how high it is. Well, we would have cheerleading practice. And at the beginning of cheerleading practice, we always had sore muscles because we were stretching out our muscles. And we'd have to climb up the 3 stories to the top building. And I remember the pain of climbing those stairs after cheerleading practice.
Did you get to slide down the fire escape?
No, that wasn't there. The other story was that top right room was our music room.
Okay.
And we had a music teacher, I think it was Mr. Hoshbach at that time, and he was demonstrating something. It was a hot summer day and the shades in the back were pulled down, and he was demonstrating something and he hit this high note, and one of the shades in the back window went flapping out to the top. Oh, was he mad? He accused all of us of doing that, but it went on his own.
It was Jim,
He didn't
wasn't
do
it?
it.
Jim did it, didn't he?
No, he wasn't even in the room. But, so those are 2 stories I remember.
Okay.
I remember the classrooms were just classrooms. I remember the basketball court. In the
Oh
back
yeah,
corner
in the
there.
back.
That was about this big. There was no room for spectators. The foul lines were about this far from the wall on all sides. It was not a good place to play basketball.
No, it was a small court. The if I remember the half court circle and the key, the top of the key intersected. Yeah. It was definitely, but it had a nice balcony you could watch the game from. That was kind of neat.
What year was that?
What's that?
What year was that?
This was built in 1906, and it went and it lasted for about 60 years. Yeah, 60 years. Although the gym wasn't built until the early 30s. Yeah, it was a WPA project actually that put it together. Right. Yeah.
Had an actual stone carved in the landing of the second, third floor. Talking about the WPA.
Oh, okay.
Is it still up or is it torn down?
Gone. Yeah, it's gone.
Because that's quite a building to tear
It is
down.
quite a building,
And that
yeah.
looks like something that lasts a long time.
Yeah.
You would
Yeah,
think so.
well-
It's quite beautiful.
Yeah, we'll take a look at it a little bit later too on here. I remember Clayton Dick many years ago told me the story about how he was in this school and they had just freshly painted all the walls and they'd come back to school and he was sitting there playing with his fountain pen and it broke and it splattered ink all over the brand new paint job. And he said the teacher came up and grabbed him by the ear and dragged him right out of the building. But the building ended up housing our K through 12. It had 10 rooms. It had 4 on the top level, 2 in the middle level, and then that kind of basement level there, I would call it a basement level, had a couple of rooms down there too. So the 2 stories plus the basement made 3 total stories of classrooms. And then they, of course, they now that we have a high school, we can offer new classes. We can offer things like chemistry and physics and advanced history and all of these classes that are important for a high school. The first class graduated in 1908. How many graduates do you think they had?
6.
Any guess? You got it. 6 graduates.
Probably
How many males and how many females?
mostly males.
6 girls and 0 boys.
Oh, man.
Yep,
That's
6
a good
girls and 0.
to come to school at.
Boys could work the farms.
Yeah, well, exactly. The boys were mostly out working the farms, and right. So 6 boys, 0 girls in that first class. The school never, the first 20 years or so, never had very many graduates. They never had more than 10 or 12 graduates at the most in a single year. As a matter of fact, 1921 set the record for the least amount of graduates. They had 1.
Wow.
Yeah. And she was valedictorian. She was also the worst. She was also the worst one in her class too. So in 1908, we started. 1907-08 was actually the first full year of classes there. We actually even had our first sports teams at IDA in 1907 and 1908, and I absolutely love these pictures. They had a men's and a women's basketball team in 1908. Nowhere to play yet. We hadn't built the gym yet. So, where do you play if you're a high school kid and you don't have a gym to play in? Where does your team play? No, they practiced outside. They practiced in Fireman's Park, actually. Okay.
Hayloft in the barn.
What's that?
Hayloft in the
That would be a good guess. Yeah, that would be a very good guess.
Tennis court.
They played in the upstairs of some of the local buildings around here. Okay. And the buildings were high enough, they had usually 10 to 12 foot ceilings, which was just high enough that if you could shoot a flat shot, then you could make a lot of those shots. Some of the buildings that are still around that they played in, the old bank building, which was right here on the corner, the big 2-story red brick building. This says Ida Bank 1912 on it. They played up there. Actually, if you go up in the attic, you'll still find the supports for the basketball hoops up there. No basketball hoops on them, but the supports are still there for the backboards. They played above a hardware store in Ida at one time, and that only happened one time because through the night of the players running back and forth and the ball, the vibrations bouncing, it vibrated everything off the walls downstairs. And so that was the last time they got to play there. One time they actually played in the Feenauer storage room next door. And so they would go in and clear all the furniture out, and they would play basketball in there. The Deerfield team that got beat that night was said to have been upset at the playing conditions because the ball kept getting stuck under a shelf. And so, but that's how they played. They would travel by horse and buggy, or they might even travel by train to some of the local teams. They would play Carleton, Deerfield, Petersburg High School. I think they played Lambertville High School at one time as well. And so those were some of the places that they played, both the boys and the girls. Now, if you were I love showing the top picture to my middle school girls, especially the ones that play basketball, because I always ask them, could you imagine playing in that? And of course they can't. But they said, why are they playing in dresses? And I said, they're actually not playing in dresses. What are they playing in? Bloomers, yeah, they're actually playing in bloomers. And I don't know if you can tell, but they have the big giant bows on their head too. I mean, really, really big bows. I don't know that they played with them. I think that might have just been for the team picture. Some of the boys that played refused to play unless they were allowed to wear sweatpants or something like that. So the coach said, well, I had some old sweatpants from college, you can wear those, because the shorts were way up to here. They said, I'm not wearing those. So but now the boys today, it's kind of coming back, unfortunately.
They were short for our guys too.
Yeah. So other sports that we had at Ida, we had a baseball team as early as about 1910 or 1912 or so. They had girls sports too. They had softball, they had, as we said, women's basketball, things like that. Track and field started later by the 1920s. Except, unfortunately for the girls though, it wasn't really considered a varsity sport until much later, which we'll talk about. But they did have that for them too. All right. Well, by about 1926, as we skip ahead, we finally decided maybe we need to build a new gym for our students. So in 1926, the school tried to get a bond to build a new gym. That failed. And so the local townsfolk got together and said, well, we can do some volunteering, and we can do some donations and things like that. So the local lumber company here donated the lumber for the building of this new gym. A gentleman who had a piece of property over by the school donated one of his lots to the school and said, yep, you can put your gym on this piece of property here. And during the school day, the kids on their study halls would go out and actually help construct the gym. The superintendent, Mr. Nicely, was even seen out there in his shirt and tie up there hammering and sawing away. Can't imagine seeing that nowadays. But anyway, so they built this brand new gym, had a stage at one end of the gym so that they could also have plays and things like that. When you would walk into the gym, you would have a ticket booth, and you would get your tickets there. There was one ring of seats all the way around the edge of the gym, and they were just basically chairs like these around the edge of the gym. There were dressing rooms in the corners for the players, and it was a real big deal, especially when you had to play above hardware stores and places like that. This picture, I absolutely love this picture, because for years and years and years, nobody that I had ever talked to had ever seen a picture of the old high school gym. And I was over at somebody's house a few years ago. They had called me over and said, hey, we have a few things we want to show you from one of my family members. So I went over and I'm looking through all these photos and things like that, and I'm going along with these different scrapbooks and whatnot, and I kept coming back to this one picture in my head, and I'm thinking about it, and I went, you know what, that scrapbook was about 1929, those photos. And that's about when that gym was around. So I went back to it. And sure enough, I'd found this picture with these 4 students sitting on the fire escape of the old school. But if you look right behind it, there is the actual gym. And that is the only picture I have ever seen of the old high school gym. I mean, I had looked for years and years and years, and stumbled across one day. And so there's the entryway. And this would be about, if you're familiar with our middle school, that would be about room 9 and 10, so it's in the original wing of our middle school. Would have been right across the street from the high school. Unfortunately, the gym only lasted 4 years. There was a big fire, and The way it happened was that in December of 1930, one of the students was in charge of going over to light the fire in the stoves to get the gym warm so that they could have practice later that night. So went over and lit the fire, and it was just common practice. And a couple hours later, as they're coming back for practice, he turns the corner of Prairie Street and he sees flames coming out of the roof. So they got the fire department over there as quick as they could. They went in and grabbed a few chairs. That's all they could save. The place burned to the ground. What happened was one of the pipes that went from this stove to that stove up along the top of the roof overheated and caught the roof on fire. And so they had no more gym to play in. The varsity boys basketball team actually suspended their season for the next 2 years since they had nowhere to play. And then they decided, well, we want to keep going. So they actually played at the Monroe Armory for a little while, and they played at Dundee High School for a little while the WPA came in and built a new gym for our IDA students. Some other little notes of interest in the 1920s and 1930s. This is about when the Ida High School newspaper started up, the Ida Highlights. Now, the Ida High School newspaper has gone through a lot of different name changes over the years. The Highlights, the Observer, the Ida Broadcasting, the News Streak was the latest one. This is actually a newspaper from, I think it's 1931. And I believe I have that copy of it back there if you want to take a look a little bit later. We've had a newspaper up until about 10 years ago. And that was run by the journalism class in the high school, but they have just mostly switched over to doing yearbook now. And so they no longer have a high school newspaper. Once in a while, they may put out an edition every couple of years just to put out a newspaper. But a regular newspaper, it was a regular thing from the 1920s all the way up until the mid-2000s or so. All right, so by 1936, well, things are really rolling along at Ida. You know, we've got this brand new gym, we have some really good sports teams, we have growth going on in our school district, you know, people are feeling good about things. And so it was at that point where the music teacher at the high school went to this lady right here, Wilma Knopfziger, class of 1936, and said, you know what, we need a fight song. We need a fight song. And she said, okay, I can write words to that. So they picked the tune. What tune did they pick? On Wisconsin, right. They picked On Wisconsin. Oh yeah, I have it up there. Okay. I didn't read down far enough. They picked the tune On Wisconsin, and she went ahead and wrote words to the fight song, and it is still the exact same fight song today, 85 years later. Only one word has changed in the entire thing. One word has been omitted. I think it's an and or something like that, just to make it a little more fluid. But other than that, the song has stayed exactly the same all the way until now. 1937, well, this was a big year for us too. Other schools were starting to get nicknames for their teams. You know, they were getting names like the Comets and the Bulldogs. And, let's see, Carleton was the Bulldogs. Summerfield eventually, or Petersburg eventually became the Bulldogs, and then Summerfield, of course. And so all of these schools are starting to get their nicknames. Ida didn't have a nickname quite yet, though. So the Ida Highlights newspaper put a contest together in February of 1937, and they said, we need a nickname for our teams here, particularly our basketball team, which is doing very well. Our boys basketball team was doing quite well that year. There's the team right here. And so the gentleman up at the top, Neil Patton, he was a freshman. He was on the basketball team. He was a JV basketball player. He submitted his nickname, and his nickname was Blue Streaks. And he submitted that into the contest, along with people that submitted all kinds of names, you know, probably Wolverines and Spartans and Wildcats and, you know, any of the popular animal names at the time. And so he ended up putting Blue Streaks in, and eventually the Highlights newspaper staff decided, you know what, that's a really great name, we're going to go with Blue Streaks. Now here's the big question. Why did he pick the name Blue Streaks? Any idea? Any idea at all?
You were on a winning streak?
Yes. The basketball team was on a school record 10-game winning streak at the time that he put this together. And the uniforms are blue, so we'll just put blue with the streaks. And we came up with the name Blue Streaks.
People say to me, if it's blue streaks, why is the streak on?
Why is the streak yellow?
Yellow. Why do they do that?
Some streaks are blue
I know.
and some streaks are
People
yellow.
say that.
Just like the spelling is different too. There are two spellings for it. There's the two-word spelling, which is the official one that he came up with. And then eventually at some point they kind of melded into one and it became one word. So it actually gets used both ways. If you read, for example, if you read The Independent, it's always one word. If you read the Monroe News, it's always two words. And so, it just kind of depends on, what your taste is, what your preference is. All right, by 1938, we're going to keep with the sports theme here. By 1938, we had men's and women's basketball, we had track, we had softball, we had baseball, we had quite a few sports, but the one sport we were missing was football. And so in 1938, we had a gentleman that came to Ida. He had graduated from University of Michigan with a teaching degree. Actually, he played football at the University of Michigan. He was all Big Ten his final year. And he came to Ida. His name was Art Valpy. And so he came to Ida in 1938, and they said, hey, you coached football, or you played football. We want to put a football team together. Would you mind coaching us? And he said, sure, I'd be happy to help do that. Back in those days, if you coached one thing, you coached everything. So he was the football coach, the basketball coach, the baseball coach, the track and field coach. He did it all. Ida's first football team, which you can see pictured here in 1938, our resources were kind of limited. The school, which had decided, we're going to go ahead and fund a football team, decided to start the team up with a grand total of $100. All right, and that bought about half the helmets, some of the jerseys, maybe a football. Didn't really buy a whole lot. So what Art Valpy did was he still had really good connections at University of Michigan. So he went back to U of M, and one of his buddies, who was the equipment manager there, he said, hey, I'm down at this school down in Monroe County, and we're starting up a football team, but we don't have anything. We really have very little in the way of equipment or anything like that, uniforms. Can you help us out? And so he said, sure, we have all kinds of things we don't use anymore here at U of M. So he loaded them up with uniforms and helmets and footballs and pads and everything. So for our first couple of years, our football team that you see there was actually wearing mostly University of Michigan paraphernalia. We didn't have a home field our first year. We played all 3 of our games on the road. The team ended up going 0 wins, 2 losses, and 1 tie. Didn't score a point all year. Their tie was a 0-0 tie, and that was against Lambertville's reserve team, their JV team. The other 2 losses were against Carleton High School. They lost 32 and 26-0. But anyway, they got the team going. They got the team started. They finally did get a home field the next year because they had to start playing some home games. They didn't have a field, so they said, well, we'll play in a literal field. So the Drutt family donated part of the land over there and said, they actually donated their cow pasture and said, yep, you can use that on game nights. So on game days, the boys would go over and clean out the cow pasture so that they could play football that night. They put up some goalposts. And if you were a fan, then you would walk right down the railroad tracks and you would go right down to the Drutt farm and you would watch Ida play for about 4 or 5 years.
Where's that now? Do you know where that's at now?
Yeah, actually, when I sit up in the press box right now, I can look right out.
Okay.
I see the ghosts of all of them running around. No, it's right over by where Drutt's farm is at right now.
More on east?
Yeah, right out by East Road.
Okay.
Yeah. That was an auspicious beginning. They got their first win in 1939. They beat Petersburg High School by a 39-0 score. So so their first win was a big win, very big win. I thought I had that turned off. Let's turn that off. Oh, we have a winter weather advisory.
What's new?
It's winter, yep. All right. Well, by 1940, things are going well. We have all these sports teams. We have all these new things going on at the school. Our population is getting bigger and bigger, and all of a sudden our school's getting a little bit too crowded for all of the students we have. So in 1940, Walter Nickel, he was our superintendent at the time, he decided, well, we're going to go ahead right across the street from the high school and we're going to expand. We're going to build a new elementary school over there. And so he built a 2-room elementary right across the street, and that housed the lower kindergarten through 4th grade students, and then the upper elementary and junior high and high school students were still at the old building over there. If you go over there now, you will see that the building actually still stands. This is the oldest part of, and oldest standing part of any part of Ida schools to this day. This is now our computer lab at Ida Middle School. My class is right on the other side of it, actually, in the old study hall. But if you look at this building and then you look at the rest of the middle school, if you're familiar with it, this part of the building on the outside definitely looks a little bit different than the rest of the building. There's the original entrance right there. If you would have walked in, you would have walked into a little hallway with coat racks and things like that. And then you would actually have classrooms on either side, and you would step down into the classrooms, and that's where the classrooms were. Now I know a couple people probably had classes in those rooms here, right? Yeah. Okay. What do you remember about? Because that looks
It was math.
very different now.
6th and 7th grade math, Miss Heatherly and
5th or
Mr.
6th
Murdoch.
grade for Miss Heatherly,
Mhm.
And Murdoch.
way down on the end, and Mr. Murdoch was on the back side.
Yeah.
Yeah.
2 math
Okay.
rooms.
And then there was the science teacher, wasn't she on the other side?
I remember the study halls, I don't
Yeah, I
remember.
remember the study hall.
I don't know.
Yeah, so about 2000, they raised the floors, knocked out the walls, made one big room out of it. There are still, if you go in, you can still recognize some parts of what was original there. You can see where the original hallway would have been by some things on the walls and whatnot. But yeah, it's that part of our building is what, 81, almost 82 years old now, and it is by far the oldest. Not by far, but it's the oldest part of our. It's the oldest part of our school. All right, well, that was this is all still in the days where we had the small school and we had all of the one-room schoolhouses around the area as well. And then in 1943, things started to change. And Harry Firestone, whose picture I elongated a little bit, he's not really that tall, okay? He looks like he's like 8'3" or something here, but he's not. In 1943, Harry Firestone came to town, and he came from the northwest part of the Lower Peninsula, and went to U of M, ended up coming down here as an English teacher in the spring of 1943, and I am guessing, I don't know for sure, I've not had anybody tell me one way or the other, but I'm guessing that he was brought in as a teacher with the expectation that he would be moving into the superintendent's position shortly, because it was only a couple months later that Mr. Nickel resigned and then Mr. Firestone took over as superintendent. My grandmother, who's 96 years old now, still remembers having him her senior year. She said, "Oh, I had him for English. He was cute."
Oh.
All right. She thought everybody was cute, so. But he actually, in college, he did his master's thesis on consolidation of schools and why it might be important to take little one-room schoolhouses and turn those into larger school districts. So when he came here, he already had that idea under his belt that he wanted to start this new consolidation movement in Ida. So in over the course of between 1943 and 1946, Harry Firestone went to all of the schoolhouses around the Ida area, and he met with all of the parents, and he met with the students, and he met with the teachers, and he said, "Here's my plan. This is what I would like to do. I would like to get you on board." And it took him a long time to get schools on board. You know, most of the folks at the one-room schoolhouses said, "No, we don't want to go into this really big impersonal school district. You know, we've had this school for 80 years here, and if we lose that, we lose our identity." You know, because every little schoolhouse was almost kind of in its own neighborhood, and people didn't want to lose their identity. And so it took about 2 years for him, but he eventually started convincing enough schools and enough parents and voters to vote for the idea of consolidation. So on May 9th, 1946, 9 of the schools in the area eventually consolidated into Ida Public Schools. Okay. That left 6 schools in the area that did not consolidate. They decided they wanted to continue, they just wanted to continue being in the little one-room schoolhouse situation that they were in. In 1946, we ended up officially naming the new school district the Ida Rural Agricultural School. And we were Ida Rural Ag for about 10 years.
What would be the advantages of consolidation?
What would be the advantages of consolidation?
Yeah.
Well, I think what he sold, according to people that I talked to a number of years ago, what he was trying to sell them on was the idea that students would have more opportunities. You know, they could have, they could have band, and they could have they could have drama, and they could have plays, and they could have better sports opportunities, and they could have junior high sports opportunities, and all kinds of things like that. So, he said the more, if we can get more people together, we might, that'll give your kids an advantage. Plus, you would have teachers that could teach one subject versus a teacher that was, very broad, teaching every subject. So I think that was part of it too. So we became, I'm sorry, what?
That makes sense.
Yeah, so we became Ida Rural Agricultural Schools in 1946, and we kept that for about 10 years or so. Now, what was really interesting about that time, was, all right, the voters have decided we're going to consolidate our schools, and we're going to send all of our kids to one school. The problem was, we didn't have school buildings to fit that number of students.
That's right.
So what do you think the solution was? It's a pretty unique solution, but it worked for a few years. Do you know what the solution was? How do we take all of these kids and put them in one district?
Alternating days?
Good guess. Yeah, that's a good guess. Some people in the past have guessed morning and evening classes. Here's what they did for a few years. Bought a fleet of buses. That was part of the deal. We were going to buy buses and bus the students in. So every morning, the buses would go out, pick all the students up, all the rural students. They'd bring them right back to Ida, drop them off right in front of the high school. Then all the students would reorganize by grade and by teacher, and then they would all get on a bus, and then they would go back to the one-room schoolhouses by grade. And so those schoolhouses became single grade or 2 grade classrooms for about 4 or 5 years. Okay. So
That's crazy. That's crazy.
it was a little bit crazy.
Yeah.
They kind of put the cart before the horse with the vote, and then they realized, oh wait, we don't, a lot more students than we thought we were going to get. But it worked. It worked for the time. And so
When you think about the difficulty of teaching,
mhm.
you gotta remember that one teacher taught 8 grades.
Right.
And that's a lot. People worry about 1 grade, 30 students or
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah.
But most of the small schools probably didn't have more than 30 students.
Right. Yeah, and you could have 5 8th graders and 1 2nd grader.
Right.
Yeah, exactly. And your numbers would be different from year to year. There were some years where a one-room schoolhouse only had 8 or 9 students. Some years they'd have 40.
The one thing that is interesting if you think about it, however, the first grader
Mm-hmm.
in that school gets to hear all of the subjects,
Right.
all of the things,
I agree.
all the way up
Yeah.
to 8 grades.
I agree.
They'd have it down by then.
It was, but the teacher had to have the ability to teach all those.
Mhm.
So that
Oh, the
person
classroom
learned
manager.
quicker.
Yeah.
Well, he was learning all the time.
Sure. Yeah.
However,
A big sponge, you
in the
know?
lower
Yeah.
grades, they only went normally a half day.
Yeah. And even I could figure stuff out after 8 times. But so that was our setup for just a few years. But our high school, all of our high schoolers, of course, came to the high school. The junior high students were here at the village school.
Is that map back there? Is that map back there to look at?
That map is not back there. I'm sorry, but I can put that up later if you want to come back up and look at it.
It's pretty cool.
Yeah, this is a map I did. It's a map I did a few years ago for
So
one of the
is
schools.
dental on there? Do you know which one?
Yeah, dental's on here.
Corner of Linwood,
Let me
Jackman?
see, this one right here. I call it the Lighthouse School. Because it looked like a little lighthouse.
Yeah,
Is that dental?
yeah.
Yeah.
Isn't that amazing?
Yeah.
You could just walk out of his front farm, was on the corner of their family farm.
Right, and it's right there.
Just walk across. the-
Little
Yeah.
bike.
Or bike, ride a bike, okay.
Yeah,
A
exactly.
little farther. Well, that's bigger than I thought it was. That's quite large.
Yeah, they weren't bad size. I mean, you know, I live in one. I live in a schoolhouse, and it's not bad
Still
size.
trying, huh?
What's that?
Still trying to learn.
Still trying to learn. Yep. I always joke with my kids. I live at school, and then I come here and teach you guys. And they don't find that funny. So by 1946, we've consolidated, and some of those promises that Mr. Firestone made of, well, you know, we can do a lot more things now. Well, that came through because then we had the Ida High School Band that started, which is now known as the Marching Thunder. Is that right, Margie? Yeah. Margie's husband is the godfather of the Marching Thunder. So, yeah, that's what I call him. So in 1946, we started the Ida High School Marching Band. I have a book back there which I think is really interesting. I would love to have you take a look at it. It's a little black book. In 1948, you know, obviously, you know, if you're a band, you have a lot of funding needs. And so the forerunner of the Ida Band Boosters was called the Ida Band Mothers Association. And so that actually started in 1948, and they started funding the band. It started with popcorn sales, started with bake sales. One of the more interesting ones they had, which you probably couldn't do nowadays, was a minstrel show. But they had minstrel shows every year for a while, and that brought a lot of money in too. And eventually they were able to buy uniforms, and they were able to buy, you know, and send the students to places that they couldn't send them otherwise. And still going strong. It's still probably our strongest booster group at school would be our band boosters. By 1974, we were actually heading overseas, and we made our first overseas trip to Holland, and that was under the direction of Mr. Lloyd Whitehead, yeah.
My
Okay.
sister went to that.
Your sister was on that group? Okay. So I assume she had a good experience, because,
Oh, that was like an amazing
Yeah.
thing. We used to have Greenwood Mall days,
right?
raised money.
Greenwood Mall, my gosh. Wow.
Yep, they would have Greenwood Mall, and they would give a percentage of their sales that day to the band, because the band would come in and play a concert on
okay.
Sundays.
Yep.
Yep,
Wow.
it was a big deal back then.
Yeah,
And you didn't just go, you had to be invited. It wasn't just like, oh, we're going.
right.
You had to be good enough to be
You had
invited.
to be good enough to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then they made that a, you know, every few years they would make an overseas trip. They would go to Holland, London, you know, different places. Austria.
Same thing, we had to be good or we didn't go.
Right. Yeah. And then, and that was usually what, every 4 years or so.
Well,
they
that
would
was,
do
that was the second trip that I took, and then from
Okay.
that point on, they started going like every 2 years to Florida. It
Right.
was simpler, but
Yeah, every
back then-
couple of years they would go somewhere stateside, and then every 2 years they might go overseas for a while, right? And our band, you know, our band has always been one of the top bands in the state of Michigan. It's always very, very large numbers, especially for, you know, school our size. When you look at other schools our size, and you look at our band and you look at their band, and our numbers are always very, very, very strong. So, Mr. Bennett is our current band director, and he's kept that tradition alive. They still go to all kinds of places, and he's keeping Mr. Whitehead's good name alive, I would say. Let's see, so by 1950, well, you know, we can't keep sending kids to one-room schoolhouses anymore, so we ended up voting in a new elementary building. Voters approved a new elementary building. The groundbreaking now, maybe somebody here knows, I'm not sure, but the groundbreaking occurred, according to several articles I've read, on September 20th, 1951. They moved in on January 1st, 1952. Like 3 months that they had this thing built, which would be record speed. Wow, I mean, it's the part of the elementary that they built would be what is now the kindergarten, first and second grade wing, and then the administration and the all-purpose room wing. All the rest of it was built later. But on September 20th, 1951, kind of a really tragic story, the school board president, Holman Self, he was one of the guys spearheading this new building, goes out there for the groundbreaking ceremony. They have the newspaper there, they have all the dignitaries there, Mr. Firestone's there, local business leaders are there. You know, they have their special shovels, they all put the shovel into the dirt, they have their, you know, have that moment, get the picture taken, have some light refreshments afterwards. And it's a real happy, wow, this is great, we're building a brand new building for our elementary students. And on the way home from there, he got into a car wreck and then died about a day later. So you never actually got to see the building that he had the groundbreaking for. But if you go into the all-purpose room right now, and if you happen to go in there, there is still a plaque on the wall that says the Holman Self Cafetorium or Auditorium, and they dedicated that to him. The building, the original part of the building, originally housed kindergarten through 6th grade. The 2 rooms down at the end were kindergarten, and then the next 2 rooms were 1st grade, 2nd grade, 3rd grade, 4th, 5th, and 6th. For a few years until they eventually started adding on and reworking that. All right. Our other big song, by the way, which I forgot to mention, was our alma mater. This was in 1951. Lila Mae Mathis, she was our alma mater. She wrote our alma mater. And I actually had a chance to talk to her a few years ago, about 4 or 5 years ago. We were writing an article for the football program that my class puts together. And the kids were writing something about the alma mater, and they asked me, well, when did she die? You know, because kids think anybody over 30 is old and dead. And I said, that's a good question. I'm not sure. I've never seen an obit for her or anything. And so we just did a little Google search, and we found out she was still alive. She's actually only in her early 80s. And she was living out in Colorado. So I said, well, why don't we get a few questions together, and we'll call her, and then we can interview her over the phone. And so they wrote some questions, and we put her on speakerphone, and we talked to her. And so we actually got to talk to her one day from Ida. And of course, the big question was, well, how did you write the alma mater? And she said, well, our band director at the time came to me, and he said that we wanted to have an alma mater, and we were going to use the Cornell University the tune to that, but we needed some words. So I was a poet. I wrote a lot of poetry for the newspaper. So he asked me if I would write the words to the alma mater. And she said, so over the course of about a week, I had this babysitting job down Geiger Road. And she said I would walk down to the house, walk back and forth, it'd be about a mile there and a mile back. She said over the course of a week of going to this babysitting job, I brought a notebook with me and I jotted down ideas and I started, cross this out, add this, add this. She said, so I basically wrote the entire alma mater on Geiger Road while walking back and forth down Geiger Road. And so she borrowed, as I said, she borrowed the tune from Cornell University. And this is the Cornell version right here, if you want to listen for just a second. You'll notice a little difference, but not much. The difference is that if you, when you listen to that, we have the 2 verses and then the chorus, and they have 1 verse and then the chorus. They do another verse and then the chorus again. So she wrote it slightly differently, but other than that, it's basically. I mean, you can tell that the tune is the same if you're an Idian. A couple of years later, by 1955, we're already outgrowing everything again. All right, we need to build another new building. So because we had some overcrowding in the high school, the voters said, yep, let's do it again. So we decided to start building a new high school. And this is a picture I found just the other day, actually, that I had forgotten I had. But this was taken from the old high school across the street as they are excavating and starting to put the new high school together. The new high school is the original building is the present-day 7th and 8th grade wing of the Ida Middle School. and then the administration wing, and then the gym wing as well. That's the current high school. Now, one really interesting story about this. There's a guy named Stephen Langdon. And Stephen Langdon was this fellow who, he was a world famous archaeologist. Okay, he would be the guy that right now, you know, if it were 100 years ago, if they had television, he'd be the guy on TV talking about the Middle East anytime something there happened, because he was, when I say he was world famous, I don't mean he was one of the most famous people or one of the most knowledgeable in his field. He was the most knowledgeable person in his field. It was Mesopotamia, which is what he knew about. But anyway, he was from Ida. He went to school in the Ida area. He became a principal at the early Ida Village School. Died in 1937, but in 1956, when we were getting ready to build this new high school, and they were thinking about changing the name of Ida Rural Agricultural School, a lady named Gertrude Golden, who was a teacher in the area, had read up on Stephen Langdon quite a bit. And she actually wrote a letter to Mr. Neiman, who was our school board president at the time, and she said, you should think about naming the school the Stephen Langdon School. All right. And so, because he is so famous, at the time he was the most important scholar to ever come out of Michigan, like the entire state of Michigan. And he was right here from Ida. So they said, you know, nothing's ever been named after him. You should really consider doing that. The school board took it up and they discussed it, but in the end they decided we're not going to name it after an individual person. But we're not going to call it Ida Rural Ag anymore. We're going to change the name of the school to Ida Public Schools. And so we eventually became Ida Public Schools. By 1957, this lady came in, Dr. Mary Campbell. She founded our hearing impaired program in 1957. And students from all around Monroe County, and I know outside of Monroe County even too, came to this, came to Ida, all over the state, different places around the country, came here because we had one of the best hearing impaired programs that you would
And why
find
did it
anywhere.
dissolve?
What's that?
I mean, why did it used to be the place? for hearing
Mrs.
impaired?
Thompson was the last one standing. Mrs. Thompson, why did it dissolve?
You want my opinion?
Keep it.
Keep it nice, okay, keep it nice. Well, I think part of it is the population was declining. Because when it originally opened, there were a lot of students that had measles, and the mother had rubella, and it caused deafness in a lot of children, and there were a lot of children with hearing impairments at that time. And I think the vaccinations and stuff that we have now kind of lessened that number. So I think that's one thing. Another thing is a cochlear implant was invented, excuse me, and so it was a way to give them closer to normal hearing, and they didn't need as much special education. So I think those two factors probably.
Wasn't she not against, but she really didn't want to do sign language.
Oh,
She
no.
wanted those kids to be.
It was an auditory,
Yeah.
it was
Right.
an auditory oral program.
Because the idea was that most people aren't going to learn sign
Right.
language,
That's
so
right, that
learn
you
how to
would be
read
able to
lips and communicate
that
right.
way.
And there were little bitty kids coming.
Oh, yeah,
Mhm.
Well, it was a preschool, they started as babies.
Mhm.
They had home visits, they had teachers that went out on home visits and started the parents teaching the children when they were first diagnosed as babies. And then at the age of about 3, they started coming into the school building. And they would come in and have school here for the day. And then many of the students, after they graduated, learned sign language. But by that time, they also were speaking quite well, so. But I think that's the main probably reasons why.
And the
And
program ended up dissolving about, you said about 2013, right?
I think, I believe it was 2012 or 2013.
Okay. But it was a very renowned program. It really was.
It was an honor to be part of it.
Yeah. By 1966, we're still growing, so we need another new high school. Voters passed another bond, we got another high school. So in 3 years, I mean, unfathomable to me that, you know, we built as much as we did in the space of 15 years. But we built a brand new high school, which is our present day high school. Of course, they had to tear unfortunately, they had to tear the old school down. I love this picture here because it actually shows the new high school that had just been completed. Before they tore down the old building, they're actually almost linked together. So that's just a really neat building. And then they started the demolition of the building in 1966, 67, and they took that down within the matter of a few weeks. Right. One great thing to come out of that whole, even the loss of the high school, was our victory bell. In 1872, you saw the original school had a bell tower at the top, had this big bell up there. When they tore the school down, they kept the bell, moved it to the old high school, the next high school, put it in the bell tower up there. By 1966, when they tore this building, when they tore the old high school down, the bell ended up in a farmer's barn for a couple of years, and then it was, I think it was Margie's class, the class of 1969. Yes, class of 69, that rescued the bell, brought it back, cleaned it up, polished it up, and ever since that bell has been ringing football Friday nights. Every time Ida scores a touchdown, the bell is out at the football field and the cheerleaders run over and ring the bell. So if you ever look at that bell on a football Friday night, understand that that bell is over 150 years old, which is just a really cool thing. Lots of drama. Well, you know, we had a dramatics program for a very long time. Went all the way back to about 1910 when, I know in 1912 actually.
Is that when Margie took it over?
That's when she took it over. They had, they had a comedy that they put together called What About Bob? I don't know anything about it, but I don't know about Bob. Anyway, and so, or no, it was called Mr. Bob. What About Bob is a Bill Murray movie. It was called Mr. Bob, sorry, yeah, it's called Mr. Bob. But anyway, and we have had dramatics all the way up through there. We've been very fortunate to have two drama advisors over the last probably 60 years, 50, 60 years. Maxine Rennie was the first one, did some really great things with our drama program, and then Margie took over about 89 or 90. And just actually finished up The Little Mermaid last week, which very nicely done. And so she's been doing that, and she promises to go another 30 years, so that's exciting. We even had teacher plays, and not in my time, but before my time, I think they always did You're a Good Man, Charlie Brown, and the teachers would actually put a play on. Try to get teachers to put a play on nowadays, but no, that would
Retired.
Yeah, retired. By the 1970s, things are really rolling, okay? Title IX brought new sports to Ida. Our girls' sports, which had been around forever, were finally elevated to varsity level. And so volleyball, basketball, all of those sports started becoming, softball, 1977, started becoming official varsity sports at Ida. We added a whole bunch of new stuff. We added some wings in the late 50s and 60s to the elementary. By the 70s, we had to add on to the high school. We had to add on to the middle school, put a whole new wing on at the middle school. Harry Firestone, after 34 years of service at Ida, decided to retire at that point. And the new guy came in, Mr. Gabehart. Herb Gabehart came in. He came in from up in the Metro Detroit area. And he actually stayed for 27 years, which is, it's incredibly rare to get any kind of superintendent to stay even for 5 or 10 years, let alone 34 and 27 years. So this must be a special place if people want to stay for that long. And we even had record student populations by the late 70s. We hit our all-time mark in the late 70s. We had just over 2,100 students at Ida High School, or Ida's public schools, which I have no idea where they fit them all. Because we're at 1,500 now, and it's not overcrowded, but it gets a little busy there. Add another 700 students, I don't know how they do it, but it's pretty amazing. The 80s were pretty lean, so lean I don't even have a picture for it. But we had a lot of budget cuts in the early 80s, things like that. The 80s were kind of, as I did a lot of research, and I grew up in the 80s here at Ida, as I did a lot of research, there weren't a ton of things that really happened, and it was just kind of a real quiet decade until the end, when it really kind of like exploded. But by 1990, this is when things really started to explode. In 1990, we had our teacher strike, and I was a junior in high school, so I remember it very well. I was one of the kids that got 7 days off. But of course, the school board and the teachers could not come to a contract agreement on some things, and so in October, the teachers ended up striking for 7 days in October. And I know, those of you that were around, I know it was big news at the time. And as a high school student, it was, every day was like a snow day, because you didn't know if you were going back the next day or not. And then eventually one day, they settled it, you're going back the next day. But it was really, and those of you that were around here know, it was really tense for a long time here. There were bad feelings for a very long time during that strike. It was one of the last strikes in Michigan too, because after teacher strikes were actually illegal, but then after this, they started actually penalizing teachers for striking. A few years later, Mr. Gabehart, whether it had to do with the strike or not, there was an attempt to try to get him ousted from his job, and he actually ended up orchestrating a board recall, and ended up getting 5 and 7 board members out. And so there were 2 board meetings where there were only the quorum was 2 board members. That was it. While they had an election and had new board members. Mr. Gabehart survived that and then ended up actually riding out his career right until 2004. We did have some really big successes in the late 80s, early 90s. Our cross-country team was a state runner-up. Our football team made the playoffs for the first time in school history in 1990. And actually, kind of funny to think about it, but the football team actually kind of helped heal the community that year, because that was also the year that it was right when the strike was happening, and now all of a sudden Ida makes the playoffs for the first time in school history, and pretty amazing.
What were the tensions over for the most part?
Just regular working conditions, salary, things like that. It had gone back to the early 80s when there had been layoffs and pay freezes and things like that, and then some of that the teachers felt hadn't been recovered. And by the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, the school was doing fairly well, and they felt like they should be compensated. So that's kind of what it was about. Our 1989 and 1994 softball teams, and later in 2017, ended up winning our first state championships ever in Ida history. Brian Kuzno, the coach right there, he was the former baseball coach who eventually turned to softball, and built one of the finest diamonds in the state of Michigan, actually. My favorite, Brian always tells me this story, but my favorite story is, he said, we had a tournament we had teams that came from all over for our tournaments, because we had such a great facility for girls softball at the time. And he said, one day, Kay Hutchinson comes down, the coach at U of M. She had just started there a few years before, and she came down to watch a couple players, and she and Brian talked, and she said, God, I wish I had something like this in Michigan. Now they do, but back then, that's a pretty nice compliment to have. I picked this picture because of the hair. Shelly looks like a lion there, actually. I don't know, but by 2000, we built, or by the late 90s, we wanted to have another bond to put a cafeteria onto the middle school and do some other things. That bond failed. That was the first time that we'd had a bond fail. But the school scraped enough money together to put the cafeteria part together, because if you were a kid like I was in middle school, every day we had to walk across, rain, snow, sleet, 20 below zero, we had to walk across to the high school to have lunch. And so they said, well, let's have our own cafeteria. So in January of 2000, we built our new cafeteria.
Jeremy, do you remember the last time they passed a bond for Ida? We don't know, was it like in the mid-80s? I've lived here 30 years and we've never had one.
No, and I think the last one that I think it was the 66 one, actually.
Right, I don't.
Yeah. Because I know they tried in the late 90s, and that one failed. And that was partially, I think, left over too from the, the strike, the recall, the, trying to get rid of the superintendent. And so, a year later, hey, we need some money. You're not getting money now. So, yeah, that was kind of bad timing, I think. Mr. Gabehart leaves in 2004, and then Mr. Dick, I don't know if a lot of you remember him. Marv Dick was he was a high school math teacher, became assistant principal, athletic director, eventually principal. I was in his office once or twice. He eventually took over as superintendent in 2004. I really felt, he was Mr. Ida, and I've always felt bad for him because he came in at a time where we had that real big recession come in, and he had to maneuver us through that. And he took a lot of lumps, unfortunately, because the school just didn't have any money, and so he unfortunately became the bad guy for that. But it wasn't his fault. But he steered us through a really tough few years there. And stayed for 6 years, ended up, I think he ended up his career at 42 years. And he was a student. He was a K through 12 student at Ida as well. By the 2010s, Rick Carson became the school, he became the next superintendent. And during his time, 2 really big projects came to fruition. One was our Ida Middle College, which basically guarantees every kid that goes through that program a high school diploma, an associate's degree, and 2 years of free college at the community college. And it's a great program, and kids can, they can get a certificate and go into welding and plumbing, and HVAC and stuff like that, or they can take those credits and take other classes and carry them on to a 4-year university if they want to, and it's all paid for. So it is what a great program for our kids. It's a 5-year program, and so he's the one that signed off on that and got that going. And then, of course, in the middle part of the decade, we got the new track built and made some improvements to the football field. And then, thanks to the $250,000 donation by the Hemmelgarn family, they were the racing family and also owned a bunch of fitness places around the country. They donated $250,000 to the project to basically get it completely funded. And so we finally got out of the Stone Age, as they said. We didn't have the stone track anymore. And then Whiteford was the last one to have a stone track, and they're actually doing theirs right now. So they're going to actually have a track to run on too. That was kind of capped off the 2010s. So those were it was a pretty good decade for Ida. But then the big question is, what does the future hold? We've had 150 years of Ida schools. Of course, it's still this month, isn't it? Yeah, it's still this month. Earlier this month, we attempted to float a bond, and that failed by 300 votes. So the question becomes, okay, what did they end up doing at the school? A few years ago, they did buy 40 acres of property from the Drutts in case they ever want to build a new school, and that would sit right over in this area. Okay, so they actually own this piece of property over here now too. And that was with the intent to build a new school. That was bought, I think they bought that back in the mid-2000s. And so there's always been talk of building a new school. The recent bond issue was, nope, we're just gonna renovate everything. And so I don't know if that was the problem or what the problem was, but anyway, they have 40 acres sitting over there if they ever want to build a new school. So that they currently own. And that's a little bit about the history of Ida schools. So for some of you who I know some of you said you were Ida folks here, Ida grads. Let's see if you can answer a couple trivia questions. Who holds the record for the longest tenured teacher in school history? Let's see, who would it be? She also taught one-room schoolhouses. She even taught at dental school.
Miss Clark.
She did. What's that?
Miss Clark.
Not Miss Clark.
Miss Conway?
Yes.
We had her.
Lois Cronenwet.
Oh,
I went to school when she was teaching.
Yeah, she is the longest serving teacher in the history of the school district, 47 years. She started in 1939 and she went all the way up to 1986 before she retired.
Good German lady, huh?
Yeah, good
Very much so.
She wrote a really nice letter to us, I'm sure I don't think she's living anymore, but.
No, she passed away about 10 years ago. So.
Anyway, before she died, obviously, she wrote just a super personal letter.
Yeah.
It was.
We had a one-room schoolhouse night here a number of years ago, and it was all about just one-room schoolhouses. And we actually had 2 one-room schoolhouse teachers, Mrs. Weiss and Miss Cronenwet. And I would say of the 30 or so people in the room that night, 25 of them had Miss Grumman. And they still got together every year with her and had reunions. And
My brother graduated with Suzanne, and back then, you could kind of do what you wanted to do, and back then, they took like all the really smart kids and put in her room, and then she just really focused on these kids,
Yeah.
and they had some very successful kids in her grade.
she was a good,
Yeah,
she
I
was a
mean,
good
she
teacher.
really took them like
I
a
don't
glove.
think it rubbed
Yeah.
off on me.
All right, so she's the longest serving of all time, but who is the active record holder that has been there the longest? Anybody knows?
Presently,
Presently,
still there.
still there.
Oh,
Roberts.
Mrs.
Who?
Fleming.
Roberts?
Brad Roberts, 45 years. Very good. He might try to break the record. I don't know. We'll see. He teaches first grade. Teaches first
He
grade.
is lost, so my mom worked for him.
Yep. He still looks the same age as he did the day he was here. I
Still
swear.
looks 30.
Yep. He's like 67. He still looks 30. All right. Remember that Art Valpy guy, the first football coach? He actually ended up as a head coach at 2 universities. Anybody know either one of them? I was at one of them on Friday, actually. Not Michigan, but
Somewhere in Boston.
He was a football
Boston, because I was in Boston.
Football coach?
Football coach.
Okay.
All right. Art Valpy was the head football coach at Harvard University and the University of Connecticut. Yep, he was at each of those, yeah. Spent 2 years at Harvard, and then he left to go to Connecticut for 2 years, and then he decided he wasn't making enough as a football coach, so he went into the oil business. Because you didn't make a lot back then as football coach.
sooner or later.
Which country school burned to the ground the night before it was to close its doors? It was in that period where they were busing kids out to those school rooms because they didn't have the elementary built yet.
Not the one on Crab and Ralph, not that one.
Crab and Route. Nope.
Okay.
You're close. All right, it was the Richardson School. Burned down the night before its last day of school, December 1951, I guess actually it would be. That was on Leghorn and Geiger. There's a greenhouse there now, green ranch house. But they burned down the night before. The kids never got to have their final party. Yeah. Who was Ida's first female superintendent?
Somebody had one.
Sandy.
Sandy?
Oh, Sandy, okay, correct. I'm thinking, not before her.
Who was Ida's first female superintendent? No, not Sandy.
No?
Nope. In 1919, that's her high school picture, but that's not when she was superintendent. But in 1919, she was actually in the very first graduating class, Grace Cooper, in 1908. 11 years later, she became Ida's superintendent of schools for about a year or two, and then she left and did something else. But she was Ida's first female superintendent. What future superintendent was named to the Class C second team All-State football team? Not Sandy Krebs.
No.
Future superintendent.
Yep. He eventually became a superintendent.
Oh. Future superintendent.
Well, we only have 4 choices.
I'm going with Harry first.
You're going to Firestone?
What do you do,
Yeah.
alternates?
Marv.
You're going to go Marv?
Marv Dick.
Yeah.
Oh, God.
Second team All-State, 1964 for Ida High School.
Forgot about him.
Name the 2 professional athletes that graduated from Ida in their sport. Anybody know?
Really?
Betty, what's her name?
Betty White.
Betty Whiting. Okay. That's one. All right. Betty Whiting, she played in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Rick Hayward, he was a hockey player that actually, mostly minor league career, but he ended up playing in the NHL for the Los Angeles Kings for a little bit. And he was in Ida High School student. Is that my last? Oh, I think this is my last one. How many other schools in Michigan currently use Blue Streaks as their nickname?
Nobody.
Zero.
Is it 0?
Is it us?
0. There was one called Detroit St. Thomas. They were the Blue Streaks, but they closed back in 1968, leaving us the only Blue Streaks in the state of Michigan. Woo!
There's several in Northwest Ohio.
There are some in Northwest Ohio, but none of them have crossed the state line. So that is it, yeah. But anyway, I want to thank you all for coming tonight. This was fun. Do you have, before we do that, anybody, I mentioned, do you have stories you want to share or anything that triggered a memory tonight? Or I heard some good stories already, so.
You need to include a food section.
A food section? Mrs. Barron?
I didn't know, like
Oh.
just cafeteria food. I did not attend until high school, but
Okay.
I hear stories from people like
The
kids
pizza?
growing up.
The
Yeah,
pizza?
certain foods in the elementary and middle school were
Well,
like.
Vivian Gross was our high school cafeteria cook when I was there, and she made all of her, a lot of her food homemade. Oh my gosh, she was so good. We were so spoiled.
Because I think one of the classes, class of 2000, 2001, I think for their 10-year reunion, they had somebody make all the food for their 10-year
Oh,
reunion.
really? Okay. Did they make the pizza on toast?
I made the pizzas for our class reunion.
Did you?
On toast, yeah.
Pizza on toast. Oh my gosh.
And
that was the best
applesauce and
stuff.
green beans. I made
Pizza,
everything
green beans,
up.
and
Yes.
what was your class? Wait. Was it on a Tuesday?
Thursday. Right. Tuesday and Thursday was on
It had to
Saturday.
be on a Tuesday.
I did, I made it for the whole class.
Yeah.
They loved it.
That was great.
Green beans, applesauce.
Pizza, green beans, and
They were
applesauce.
loving it.
And then every day was, every Thursday was Taco Thursday, and one time they did it Wednesday and they had to shut school down because it was on Wednesday.
We didn't have tacos, we never get
Oh,
tacos.
see, we did it.
We have hamburger Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday in some form. It might be a hamburger, it might be
In
beef
some
stroganoff, it might be pizza, Friday was fish.
Salisbury steak.
It was some kind of
Oh,
hamburger
yeah.
all week long.
You talked about taking the train to school.
Yeah.
They'll tell the stories about where would you ride your bike to, and then park your bike at the little store, and then pick the train to Dundee.
Lulu.
Oh, Lulu?
Used to stop at Lulu, the Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
We used to stop at Lulu.
Yeah.
And there were about 6 or 7 of us that would meet at Lulu at the Dutcher's store, which was, I don't know when that went away. It was still
On
in
the corner there.
yeah, right next to the railroad track.
Mhm.
And we catch it to Dundee, get off at the grain elevators,
Mhm.
and walk to the high school.
Hmm.
And then that was 1.5 miles.
Yeah.
Talk about
So
rain
we
and
were
cold.
late. We were late almost
Every
every day. But 'cause I think we'd leave about 8 o'clock a.m. It might have been earlier than that.
Huh.
And then we would get off at the grain elevator and walk to school. I think we'd get there about 9:30, something like that.
Do you remember anybody that you rode the train with? My uncle Bryson Bennett rode
What's his
the
last
train.
name? Bennett?
Bennett.
When was he in high school?
Bill was born in 30,
Um,
1930.
I was in high school at Dundee.
my uncle was
That-
born in 29 or 30.
Yeah, so about the same age.
Bennett?
Yeah,
Grayson
then-
Bennett.
Bryson Bennett. And then there was Appleman. He also rode the train.
Donna?
No, his brother.
Oh, brother.
Appleman, I remember.
Yep.
But people would ride that train from Samaria
Mhm.
and went to Dundee High School. They get on the train at Samaria. You know, that's not the Temperance, but
Yeah.
it's a hell of a long way
It's a long
from
way.
Dundee. But the
Huh.
Ann Arbor went through that town and it would stop and pick up some students there and stop at Lulu.
My favorite story is when Bill, when I married his daughter, my wife, I had to hunt, you know. If you don't hunt and fish, you don't get married in the Herring family, you know, So my favorite story, I think he was he was 9 years old in 4th grade. Him and his friend took their shotgun to school.
Yeah.
I said, well, what did you do? Well, what did the teacher say? Well, the teacher probably said, well, that's a nice Stevens single shot. I like that. That's nice. And you put it in your little book bag, room,
Yep.
or whatever. You hang your coat up.
Yep.
You know, hang your backpack up, and then hunt on the way home. They'd hunt for
Oh, yeah.
pheasants and rabbits.
Yeah.
I'm like, could you imagine taking guns to school today?
Oh, no.
And your teacher said, that's a nice shotgun. I like that. I would just like that. Okay, just put it
Well,
in.
I think
Best story.
she made us keep the gun while classes were going
In the
on.
locker.
Yeah.
No, in the woodshed.
Oh.
We had a little building there that we used to be the wood, for a wood stove, they kept the wood in it to be dry and so forth. At that time, we had an oil store.
What a great American story, right?
That's a good story.
Is that the best?
It is, yeah.
Oh,
I have another one, believe it or not, honest to God. We used to have Slave Day.
Have what?
Slave Day.
What?
It's,
Slave Day. And it wasn't just the kids, it was out there, so 8th graders were the masters. And you could pick, did you have it? 6th and 7th grade.
You could pick your slaves?
And for the day, you could make them wear whatever they wanted to wear.
Oh my
Do
gosh.
whatever you wanted them to do, and the teachers.
Unbelievable.
I remember wearing garlic around my
I'm
neck.
from the South and we never had that.
You believe it? Can you and it wasn't even a thing like, oh, you shouldn't do that, it was just, it was in the
Just the day, it was the day in the curriculum.
And you're my slave tomorrow and you're gonna wear this,
Yes,
right?
and you're gonna carry my books, you're
Oh
gonna
my
crawl down the
God.
hallway,
Oh my God.
whatever
I
they
have
want.
slave day, it's called Tuesday.
Oh, Monday's your slave day.
Isn't it something? Could you ever imagine that today?
No.
That's when you were talking about the minstrel shows. Can you imagine what happened if you tried to do
Oh, yeah.
blackface?
Yep. I had my favorite Miss Cronowet story, because one of her students told it that night here, was the dental school kids and the Lulu kids would a lot of times play softball together.
yeah,
And she said, so the one year there were only about, she said, I only had about 8 or 9 students even there that day. So we walked down to Lulu to play. And well, anyway, this gentleman was telling us how he was young, 6 or 7 years old, and he had to pitch. So he was pitching, and one of those big kids came up and just hit a line drive right back and hit him in the head and knocked him out cold. And he said, so I came to, and my head's throbbing, and I'm crying, and Miss Cronowet's standing over me, are you all right? And she helps me up gently, and she's gently taking me off the field, and I thought she was gonna take me over to the bench, and no, she puts me behind the plate because I made 9. They'd have to forfeit if
They used to play dartball.
And she sat there and she just went, nodded her head, she said, yep.
They played dartball too back then. in the
Oh, did
winter
they?
time.
Did you?
churches.
Yeah.
The Lutheran churches.
Right.
A dart ball.
So like baseball, but with darts.
Yeah,
Because you're inside of snowy out, that was your baseball game. You thought.
Yeah.
I went and got some dock lives off of Summerfield and the Wagon Neck, Dale Wagon Neck's farms there.
Mm-hmm.
And I got some eggs before he passed away and stuff and some firewood. And I'm like, and they're the nicest couple and they're inviting me in for some, like iced tea and some apple pie. And I'm like, this is great, And so I said, how old are you guys? And this was like 3 years ago. They was like 88 or so. And I said, do you know the Herrings, Wilfred? And, oh, well, yeah, my dad used to rent a part of a icebox locker in Ida from your dad, because nobody had freezers back then. And you'd put
Food locker.
you'd hang your meat in there, and I guess your dad had a bigger locker, and he'd rent out space. And he said, we used to play dartball together at the Lutheran church. I'm like telling Bill and Nancy, you gotta meet this couple. They're like your friends from grade school.
Yeah.
Small world, right?
Oh, yeah.
Well, you're talking about the churches having German services. Bill's dad was always the one that he gave the
German mass.
German
Oh,
services always at Christmas because he.
He said that was the busiest one. When you had the German services, that was the most crowded
Oh,
one.
yeah.
Well, it's St. Mark's Lutheran Church at that time. It's
Mhm.
now been consolidated with River Raisin or some group down there.
Yeah.
But at that time, he used to do that annually, and people from all over there, that area would come and they'd put on a German service. But mostly, naturally, they'd be old.
Yeah.
I couldn't believe some of these cemeteries around here. My wife and I, for some reason, would just drive through in the summertime, and all the tombstones were in German.
Yeah. Oh,
You
yeah.
stop at some of these Lutheran churches, look at their cemeteries, and some people were born in the late 1700s that came here and immigrated here. And they're all chiseled, all in German. 90% of the gravestones are in German around
Oh,
here.
yeah, yeah.
So when you said German, this is a
Yep.
huge
Oh, yeah, there's
German
even some
area.
at the St. Joe's Church there too, in the cemetery. There's
I couldn't believe it.
Yep, in the old part.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again for coming. Feel free to take a look at some of the things if you want to back there.
Yeah, we're talking about Tennessee schools.
We used to raise